Good afternoon. My name's Cam Spence. I'm the Director of Educational Development for Armstrong International. Thank you for taking the time from your day to join us for today's webinar, Critical Health Benefits of Proper Humidification. As many of you are aware, indoor air quality is and continues to be of major importance to institutional facilities such as hospitals, nursing homes, and higher ed facilities. It also includes commercial office buildings with large personnel occupancy. The recent COVID-19 situation has increased the sensitivity and importance of maintaining good indoor air quality, in which humidification plays a major role. Today, we'll share the critical benefits of proper humidification as well as some of the most recent ASHRAE recommendations. I have the privilege today to introduce our subject matter expert, Mr. Joel Boynton. He's in charge of our North American humidification for Armstrong International. Joel's responsible for sales and service and direction of product development. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering from Western Michigan University and has over 12 years experience in the humidification industry. He's also an active member of the ASHRAE Technical Committee on Humidification. So without further ado, Joel, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thank you, Cam. Well, like Cam said, I wanted to put together, we decided to put together a presentation, webinar based about humidity. I think it's pretty well known that humidification is required in healthcare. But I think a lot of people miss the benefits of humidification outside of healthcare. And this will speak directly to those applications. So let's dig in. First of all, so you guys can see my pretty face. This is me. My name is Joel Boynton. As Kim said, I'm the North American Sales Director for Humidification at Armstrong. That's my email and that's my phone number. Please call me if you have any questions, or feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, we can ask questions through this format as well. A little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be approximately an hour. I can tell you right now it'll actually be shorter than that. I didn't want to bore you all with too much research. All participants will be muted except for me, and Cam can talk if he wants. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A section during the presentation at any time. There should be a little chat box that says Q&A, not the chat box that will, you could put questions there, but the Q&A is really meant where they're meant to be. This webinar session will be recorded, and so if you want a copy of that, please let us know, and we can help you get a link. We also recommend closing out any background apps or browsers that may impact your streaming quality. I don't know about you, but I'm working from home, and I hope that my kid decides not to play an intense video game right now. It may affect our streaming quality. Also, I wanted to put a plug in for our upcoming webinar on next Wednesday, June 10 at 2 p.m., same time, same channel. Armstrong is going to be presenting Steam as a Service. We've partnered with Mura and Hartford Steam Boiler to offer Steam as a Service, which basically means we can provide steam for a facility or for a customer, where we handle all of the generation of the steam, and that operator or that end user can just pay a single monthly payment for it. So we do all the turnkey solution. We handle the generation, and you can sit back and just use the steam as you wish. So that's coming up next Wednesday, June 10th. Armstrong, Mura, and Hartford Steam Boiler working together to provide steam as a service. Okay, digging into health and humidity. I'd be completely remiss to begin a presentation of health and humidity without including the Stirling chart. And I think if you've ever done any research into health and humidity, the Stirling chart is probably the first thing you're going to see. In fact, I remember seeing reps and other humidifier manufacturers breaking out the Stirling chart right at the very beginning of this whole COVID thing, COVID-19. When it first became aware, people were sharing the Stirling chart to show its importance, the importance of humidity. And this was generated in 1985 by Stirling, and it's come into question a little bit since then whether or not it's still important. I think people feel uncomfortable relying on something that has an older source. So there have been a lot of recent studies. There's actually a lot of activity in the humidity and health research area right now. And every study that I've seen, which I'll share some of them with you in the next few minutes, reinforce the Stirling chart, especially on the respiratory infections and bacteria and virus transmission criteria. So the Stirling chart still stands, and I love that it does because it's so simple. It clearly depicts that we need 40 to 60% RH to reduce bacteria, reduce viruses, reduce fungi, reduce respiratory infections and asthma. And one thing that's actually not shown on this is chemical interactions such as formaldehyde, off-gassing, and things like that. So Stirling chart still stands. Also, just a note, 1985, I was 3 when that came out, so I'm glad to see that things from back then still are applicable. ASHRAE's stance on infectious aerosols. So COVID-19 came out, and everybody was kind of in a panic, right? There was this epidemic, and people didn't really know what to do, what the recommendations would be. We knew that we needed humidity, at least experts in the field did, or experts out there knew that humidity would help, but nobody really wanted to do much about it until they really had recommendations. So on April 14th, ASHRAE finally came out with their position document on infectious aerosols, and you can see the screenshot of the cover page there on the right. And in that document, they said that they made a lot of recommendations, but the two that really apply to this presentation are, number one was increase outdoor air ventilation as much as possible, even as much as 100% outside air, to bring fresh air into the building. And number two was maintain temperature and humidity as applicable to the infectious aerosol of concern. We'll dig a little further into number two here on the next slide. So number two, if you dig into that a little bit more, they say that studies show, and that's within the same document that I listed on the last page, studies show that the RH between or below 40% is associated with 3 factors that increase infections. First, as discussed previously, infectious aerosols emitted from a primary host shrink rapidly and become droplet nuclei, which we'll talk about more later. And these dormant yet infectious pathogens can remain suspended in the air and are capable of traveling great distances. When they encounter a hydrated secondary host, they can rehydrate and are able to propagate the infection. So they're saying 40%, humidity below 40% can create droplet nuclei, which is a problem. Then they say, second, many viruses and bacteria are anhydrous resistant, and they have increased viability in low RH conditions. And then finally, they say immune biologists have now clarified the mechanisms through which ambient RH below 40% impairs mucous membrane layers. And so we'll talk quite a bit about that as well. I normally don't just read from the slides, but these are important things, and it's ASHRAE reinforcing that they believe humidity should be above 40%. So I wanted to kind of set the tone for the rest of the presentation with those 3 points. First, let's talk about before we get to some of those critical points, I wanted to share a little bit about absolute humidity and influenza. There was a study by Shaman um, about absolute humidity, creating a correlation between absolute humidity and influenza. Normally, you see the flu season is sort of in the winter, and actually, in this case, you can pinpoint it to the winter when there's the lowest, a significant drop in absolute humidity. We can predict that sometimes we don't know when that time will come. I get all excited about these charts, but basically they show some climatic data regarding specific humidity. Oh, let me get my pointer out here. This one shows specific humidity climatology for Arizona, Florida, Illinois, New York, and Washington. So they looked at several different regions across the country because obviously absolute humidity is different based on the region. And they looked at some other climatologies. If we look at the next slide, you can see that they drew conclusions based on that climatology if they related them to an epidemic of influenza. So there was a drop. You can see this trough of absolute humidity, and they're saying that 10 days relative to that drop in humidity, there's a influenza epidemic. And this is so proven that if we look at the next slide, researchers are now using it to do research regarding influenza. So they can find the absolute humidity trough in the location that they want to study. This happens to be a study by Dr. Ryman. She did an interesting study regarding influenza in school settings, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but not go too in depth on. So we know that absolute humidity will predict a flu outbreak onset. And so that pretty clearly shows that influenza is affected by absolute humidity. If that's why this COVID-19 kind of came as a surprise coming in the spring when absolute humidity was a little bit higher. Moving on, we can talk more specific about the points in the ASHRAE document. So first would be humidity and bioaerosols. What are bioaerosols? They're airborne biological particles derived from virus, bacteria, or fungi. So it's basically small airborne particles. I think everybody's familiar with wearing a mask nowadays, and that is because of concern about bioaerosols traveling. And that's one of the reasons why masks were recommended in places where you were in close proximity with other people to prevent COVID-19 transmission. So you can see on this chart, bioaerosols have generally different sizes, and different sizes will hold different things. Bacteria tends to be in the 1 micrometer range. Viruses travel a little bit smaller. So let's look a little bit about how they move. If you're just standing still, the human can expel bioaerosols with regular breathing about 1.5 meters. What's interesting to note here is that 87% of exhaled bioaerosols are less than 1 micrometer. So if you have less than 1 micrometer, they can last about 12 hours in the air, but they'll travel to the ground. So you have 1.5 meters, but if that same person is coughing or sneezing, we can project them significantly farther. And there's a lot going on this chart, so I'll kind of step through it. First, there's an infected person coughing or sneezing. in the bottom left corner. This shows that if you cough, an infected person coughs, hopefully none of you are infected, you can project a bioaerosol 2 meters. So you get a little further than just respiratory, just breathing, with a velocity of 10 meters per second from a cough. If we have a sneeze, you have a higher velocity, so that will project those droplets further, 6 meters. If the relative humidity is right, this infected person could cough or sneeze, and those droplets may become droplet nuclei. And that's what we want to prevent, because then you're looking at up to a 10-meter transmission. Droplet nuclei basically is a droplet that has a certain that has evaporated and become dried out on the surface, and it will float a lot farther and still carry the virus. So if the person on the other end, within 10 meters or 6 meters or 2 meters, inhales, and that droplet is a certain size, it can be inhaled into their respiratory tract and then infect them. So we know that droplets can travel through the air. We know that droplet nuclei have significant more distance, and now we want to reduce the possibility of having droplet nuclei and reduce the travel distance of any of these. Well, relative humidity plays a role in that. Nodi did research on exactly that criteria. If you look at this chart on the bottom is relative humidity, and on the vertical axis is percent transmission. So they studied that the virus transmission relative to relative humidity. So if we look at low relative humidity on the left side, virus particles are stable, droplet nuclei form, because that drop enters the air and it's dried rapidly and becomes a lighter particle and will travel further and becomes smaller and will travel further through the air. If we look at 50% relative humidity, virus particles are unstable because the nuclei, the droplets can't decide. It's unstable because it's between forming droplet nuclei from dry environment and forming droplet nuclei from a moist environment. So we find that 50% RH is actually the least stable for droplets in the air to travel. And then at extremely high humidity, droplet nuclei take on water and then they'll just fall out quickly. But that's not really an acceptable environment for humans. So next, let's look at humidity and how it affects the respiratory tract. Here's a nice diagram by Mariyama, and this diagram shows all of the factors involved in this. We're going to kind of look at the one factor of humidity, holding temperature and air change rate and some other things stable. You can see there's other factors: temperature, the absolute humidity, which I spoke about, sunlight, vitamin D status. And interesting enough, this research was just updated this month in response to COVID-19. They had done this research quite a while ago, and they decided to update it, and it's still in review, but the standings from the original research still stand. So it's kind of interesting that they're updating this because it directly applies. Again, two people standing a certain distance away from each other. They have airborne aerosols, droplet spray or direct contact, or they have indirect contact through a fomite, which a fomite is an object that can pass a virus from one person to another. Like say a cell phone. You set your cell phone down and someone else picks it up that could have a virus on it, and that's considered a fomite. So continuing into this research, humidity does protect the respiratory tract. Speaking of that, I need a drink. Humidity does protect the respiratory tract, and here's a nice little chart showing it. If you look at a human, they have mucus in their body, and that mucus is there to protect your cells. If you have low humidity, your mucus will be lowered, which I'll show you in the next slide. But that mucus is there to prevent viruses from actually making contact with cells where they can be received into the body. Things like yeah, let's go to the next slide. So here, oops. So here we can see a comparison between hydrated mucus and dehydrated mucus. Sorry to say mucus so much, but it's just going to happen. Hydrated mucus, like at 50% RH, is well hydrated, and it can protect the body well. At lower dry indoor air, which I think everybody feels in the winter, especially in the Midwest where I live, you can tell that your throat becomes dry and you become uncomfortable. And that's because your mucus is dehydrating. And when that happens, you're more susceptible to virus transmissions because of all these reasons, increased mucus density, decreased cilia motion, increased inflammation risk, and decreased tissue damage or reduced tissue damage. This is a nice diagram that again kind of shows that same thing. This is everything that's going on uh, within your respiratory tract to keep you safe. You have mucus secretion. Viruses are landing on the mucus and it's being transmitted away. If you have low humidity or less sunlight, other innate defense mechanisms get lowered. Antiviral immunity gets lowered through macrophages, and you have increased sensitivity to inflammation activation. So again, reinforcing 50% RH. This is another study. 50% RH is good for your lungs. And the last part about lung health and humidity is a study that was done testing the mortality of mice exposed to aerosolized influenza. So in this study, they exposed mice to influenza, and they had different relative humidities. If this looks familiar, it's because it's from the ASHRAE journal, or I'm sorry, the ASHRAE handbook. It's in the humidity chapter. It's significant enough for that. And you can see the trough, 40 to 60% RH, decreased mortality of mice based on or from influenza. So 40 to 60% RH does reduce the influenza risk. I won't bore you with by going through too many examples of the research, but there is quite a bit more. I just wanted to share at least two more in summary. The first one is Humidity as a Non-Pharmaceutical Intervention for Influenza A by Chris Pratt, also by Jennifer Ryman. And in that study, they did they had two classrooms for preschool, and they humidified one classroom and didn't humidify the other. And I hope the parents got to pick which one their kids went into. I don't know how that really worked, but she shows some interesting, and Chris shows some interesting results from that. They did see decreased sick days from the children in the humidified classroom. And then another one is dry eye symptoms in offices that deteriorate work performance by Wolkoff. That one shows reduction in work performance based on dry eyes and dry air. So humidity can increase work performance as well. I didn't really want to dwell too much on all this research, so I thought that I would summarize those. If you want a link to them or further explanation, please contact me, and I'd love to talk about them more. But it is kind of a, pardon the pun, it's kind of a dry subject, but I'd love to dig into it more if you want. So in summary, I'm going to say 40 to 60% RH is recommended for occupied spaces, even if it's not healthcare. It decreases bioaerosol travel distance, decreases virus transmission, and promotes a healthier respiratory tract. So that's kind of what I have on the research and the proof that humidity creates a healthy environment and a good indoor air quality. So now I want to kind of take a step in the next step, and so what do we do next? I think there are two things. First, you could assess current humidifiers for size and operation, and I think, and then the next thing is consider adding humidification to an unhumidified space, such as an office. So let's go down that road a little bit. So first, assessment of current humidification. I did a quick search in my email, and this was the oldest humidifier that I could find in my email. It happens to be an Armstrong direct injection. I haven't been around too long, but I think that's a Series 80 by Armstrong. And that's an old humidifier. It predates probably almost everyone on this call. But it's still working, and you could get it working again if you needed to. So I think that's the first step, is to assess the humidifiers in your space. I know that there are a lot of humidifiers out there that are turned off, and part of that's because they haven't been maintained, or part of that's because they weren't properly sized to begin with. And so we'd love to do an assessment of humidifiers. If you're interested in that, please contact us. Your local representative is ready to help with any questions or an assessment of your humidification system. The other thing that's important about a humidifier assessment is, if we look at the ASHRAE recommendations to increase the outdoor air, they're looking at possibly 100% outside air systems that weren't doing that before. So even if you have a humidifier that's currently working and installed, it may be significantly undersized if you meet the new recommendations from ASHRAE. So we'll need to look at that sizing as well. And then lastly, if you have humidification, are you humidifying all the areas that are important? So what if there is no humidification? I think of a lot of office spaces that I think could really benefit from humidification. And in that case, we need to do an assessment of where we could put your humidifiers, and that will really be critical to have somebody from Armstrong or an engineering firm come in and do an assessment and find the right place and the right resources required for adding humidifiers. We can kind of glance at the first criteria that are required. You have to decide which areas are critical for humidification. I would say the ones that are occupied heavily. And then we can look at the size of humidifiers that would be required for at least 40% RH. We have a HumidiWare tool that's available on our website to do that if you want to kind of dip your toe in the water yourself and get an idea of where what your humidifier sizing would be. But also your local rep or Armstrong is absolutely available to help. Looking at humidifiers, We recommend, and ASHRAE recommends, steam for humidification. I don't think that should come as a surprise if you know Armstrong as a company. We really love steam, and it's in our blood, and we invented the steam humidifier back in the 1940s. So it really is the best way to humidify. And ASHRAE also believes that if you read chapter 22 of the handbook, it recommends steam for humidification if it's available. If there isn't steam available, then we can look at electric humidifiers, gas, or possibly adiabatic humidification, which is a kind of newer technology, very efficient and has great maintenance too. So adiabatic may be the way to go. Now I'll take some time for questions and answers. I see one question so far. Please feel free to type questions into the Q&A box, and I'd be happy to answer them. Right now, I'll answer the first one, which is, what about relative humidity in data centers? Data center relative humidity is set up for 35% RH plus or minus 15%. That's a really good range, I think. So at data centers, we could go down a whole discussion about data center humidity, but data centers have really increased the range. I've seen this specifically cites 35% RH plus or minus 15%, and I've seen that range broadened widely in the last year. Some data centers are running up to 80% RH and have been I'm sorry, I'm still reading questions. Some data centers are allowed to run up to 80% RH, so they can take advantage of free cooling from an adiabatic humidifier, such as I showed on the last slide, like this evaporative cooling here. So data centers, you'll see quite a bit of quite a lot of humidification in those. The next question that I saw was, are there concerns about direct injection from a boiler? I do address this in a lot of my other presentations. I'll give you the quick version here. We do not have concerns about direct injection from a boiler. ASHRAE still recommends direct injection from a boiler for humidification, and for those that don't really understand where that's coming from, the short version there is that there are amines in boiler steam, and the amines are there to prevent corrosion in the distribution piping. However, we believe that if you have a properly designed humidifier, such as our direct steam humidifier, with good separation and a good design, you can reduce that chemical output well below OSHA standards for humidity into a space, an occupied space. So yes, chemicals are in that steam, but we mitigate that risk by lowering the chemical content so far that it's well below OSHA standards. I think it's 1/10 of OSHA, and so we do not believe that that's a risk. That was a good question. There was another question about Legionnaire's disease, and that comes up quite often, especially when I'm speaking about adiabatic humidifiers. Legionnaire's was originally a problem from a humidifier, and so it's been tied to that ever since. But if you're using an isothermal humidifier, so that would be steam injection, electric, or gas, those humidifiers inject steam into the air. And as long as you design your humidifier properly so that steam doesn't wet on anything, there's no risk of Legionnaires because there's no standing water to grow bacteria in. Where it's become more of a question is as we get deeper and deeper into adiabatic humidifiers, such as the EvaPack, our evaporative unit, where you do have a tank of water in the duct. In those cases, we take a lot of precautions to prevent Legionnaires. For instance, in the EvaPack, the media is impregnated with silver ions to prevent bacteria propagation. We make sure that the drain pan drains completely and that all the hoses drain completely. So there aren't really many risks with humidifiers as long as they're done properly. I haven't seen Legionnaires related to a humidification example in my career. So we just have to pay attention to what we're doing. Good. I don't see many other questions coming in. Those were some good ones. Legionnaires is definitely a good one. I should have included that in. So it is important that when you design your humidifier that you take everything into consideration to do it as healthy as possible. Oh, I'm being told there may be some. I didn't have my Q&A open. Thank you, Jamie. All right, so now I have more Q&A here. There's one question about absolute humidity and more data. I can share the specific study, but they seem to show that when absolute humidity drops 3 kilograms per pound or 3 kilograms per kilogram, then that's when they can predict a 10-day epidemic of influenza. Another question, do you suggest using steam out of a boiler? Yeah, we talked about that. Yeah, a lot of these are due to amines, so hopefully I addressed that. There's another question that says, does Armstrong offer an analysis of dew points and facility envelope recommendations to prevent excessive condensation and mold that can happen in climates that see cold winters? I think that's a very specific application question. I'd like to address that directly. Please contact me and I'd be happy to talk about it. But in general, you have to humidify to your application. And so if you are in the Midwest like we are, where you have cold climates, and 40% RH won't work because you're going to condense on your windows, then I think you humidify as much as you can. That's kind of the example that I'll take there. There's one question that says, what is the cost per square foot to add humidity? And I'd like to say that I wish that I had a number like that, but we find that each place is so different on a case-by-case basis, and especially climates are different on a case-by-case basis, that we haven't been able to come up with a generalized number.
Hey, Joel, could I suggest that you put your front slide that has your contact information on it while you're going through this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you want to contact me, here's my information again. I'm sorry, I'm just reading through the Q&A real quick. I didn't have a chance while I was presenting, so we're and then Jamie finished up with we will be sending out the link to the recording after this. Oh, there was a question just further into the boiler chemicals, the way that we handle the chemicals. Um, I don't have a slide to kind of show this, but what we do in our direct steam injection humidifier is we separate out the moisture from the steam to make sure that we have small droplet size steam or dry steam, I guess it could be called. And when you separate out that larger particle, those larger particles, that takes 85% of the chemical content with it down with the condensate into the condensate system. So you're taking that chemical content out with the larger droplets, and they're going down the drain essentially, or into the chemical condensate return. And we can, yeah. So please feel free. That seems like the end of the questions right now. Um, please feel free to contact me directly with any specific questions, and I'd love to answer them. Uh, Thank you for attending. And again, just one more plug for our upcoming webinar on Steam and Service, Steam as a Service, Steam as a turnkey solution, where you can just pay a monthly fee and we'll do the hard work for you. At that, I'll end this presentation and thank you for joining.